kind of.
And I will.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you for excellent. I am honored to be here today. My name is Jeffrey Crean. I'm a professor of history at Tyler Junior College. Today we will be talking about changing global demographics, about the changing populations in different continents, what has developed over the past couple decades, what will develop over the rest of the century, and how people will move within regions and between regions. Now, one of the big things we'll talk about near the end here is urbanization, and that we're going to have, for the first time in global history, most human beings living in cities, living in urban areas where traditionally populations were overwhelmingly rural and living out in the countryside. Now, the important thing to remember here is when we're talking urban areas, we think, cities like Dallas or Houston or Seattle or what have you. But when we're looking globally, especially in this present day, when we're talking about the cities that are growing, the sort of mega cities that have, not just 5 million people, but 10, 20, 30 million people, we're talking about urban conglomerations where people are essentially living in what we would call slums or shanty towns. So what you see here on this slide, this picture here is of Lagos, Nigeria, one of the world's largest and fastest growing cities in the world. And you see how most people live in these sorts of makeshift shacks built by themselves without access to sewage treatment or plumbing or running water or, as you can see, paved streets or things like that. You can see kind of more standard urban areas way in the background with taller buildings and so forth. But in fact, what's going to happen in the future is approximately 2 billion people live in these sorts of conditions around the world. And that's going to be in many ways, the future of humanity, and especially in the poor developing world in Africa and Asia and South America, where most people are living and will live in the future. And so that's important to understand when we're talking about urban areas. We're talking about very different urban areas in terms of how people live than what we know here in the United States. Now, I'm going to cover 5 different topics. First, we'll start in general and move specifically. We'll talk about overall global population trends. Then we'll talk about regional population trends by continent, which places are growing, which are shrinking, which are staying the same. Then we'll look at fertility rates, which in general around the world are declining, some places more than others, but we'll see that the global population, which has increased over the previous century or two, and has grown quite explosively, especially in the previous century, will start to stagnate. And in fact, over the next 150 years, will actually start to decline. And then fourth, we'll talk about what I had in my cover slide about urbanization, about the growth of cities. And then finally, we'll talk about migration, not just people moving from the countryside to the cities in their local areas, in their local countries, but moving across different continents, the areas that are exporting people, the areas that may be importing people. Okay, so first, global population trends. Now, at the time of Columbus, at the time of the discovery of the Americas, what you had is you had approximately, 500 million people in the world. 500 million people in the world. And by 1800, as industrialization started to take off and as more areas had more intense agricultural settlements, you had 1 billion people. So in 1800, you had 1 billion people. The population grew about 60% in that century, so that you had 1.6 billion by 1900. The population quadrupled in the 20th century, such that by the year 2000, you had 6 billion people. Currently, around our time, 2022, you have about 8 billion people. So the population has continued to grow fairly quickly. But by 2100, you'll have, and we don't know this because demographic predictions are highly inexact, you will have by the year 2100 between 9 billion and 11 billion people. So the population will continue to grow throughout the century, though at a much slower rate. And as you will see, the growth or decline varies markedly between continents. Now, this shows in graphic form, the red line is the percent of annual growth rate, and the blue is the cumulative overall population. So you can see here this sort of exponential growth throughout the 20th century, especially after 1950, where the population between 1960 and 2000 roughly doubled from 3 billion to 6 billion. So you see kind of this almost, vertical escalator of population carrying up, close to the present day. But that's going to start to taper off over the course of the rest of the century, and then kind of flatline and peak around the year 2100. And you can see that in the red line, where growth was growing at a large rate, about a 0.6% from throughout the 1800s into the early 20th century. And then in the 1900s, the growth rate spiked markedly between 1950 and 2000, and then has declined and will continue to decline until by 2100, you'll have a 0.1% estimated growth rate. So the population by the end of this century, by the beginning of the 22nd century, won't be growing at all. This shows where people live. So you can see in the brown areas, this is where you have the highest population density. So throughout Europe, throughout the eastern half of North America, along the periphery of South America, especially along its Atlantic coast in Brazil and Argentina, in sub-Saharan Africa, and we'll talk more about Africa shortly, but you see in sub-Saharan Africa where the population is dense. You see also, and then of course in Asia, you see great population density in India, and kind of this crescent from India through Southeast Asia to southern China and into northern China, where you see the greatest conglomeration of people. And in fact, currently about 6 out of every 10 human beings lives in the Asian continent, about half of them in that crescent from Pakistan and India through southern Asia into China. And now we move on to the regional trends that you have. Growing Africa. So Africa is where most population growth is going to happen from here on out for the rest of the century. It's going to be the one continent which is still going to have a large growth rate. So Europe will be shrinking, and Asia and the Americas, both North and South America, will be stagnating, if not shrinking slightly. So between the continents, you have markedly differential growth rates. Now, so we start first in Africa. So Africa in 1900 had 133 million people, about 8% of humanity. And by 2000, its population had increased sixfold over the course of the 20th century. Of course, much of the rest of the world, Asia, Europe, the Americas, their population had also increased. So still in the year 2000, only 1 in 8 humans lived on the African continent. Now, you'll notice over the past 20 years, you've had significant growth in Africa from 800 million to 1.34 billion, such that Africa now constitutes about 1/6 of humanity. That population will continue to grow by 2050, so that by 2050, it's estimated that 2.5 billion people will live on the continent of Africa. 1 in 4 humans will live in Africa. So therefore, that's a substantial growth from 800 million to 2000 to 2.5 billion in 2050. That's a tripling of the population, where much of the rest of the world will be growing at much slower rates, if at all. This is because Africa's population is younger. There is more land that has been less settled. The population is also poorer. As populations get wealthier, raising children becomes more expensive, as I'm sure you all know, and therefore families, for economic reasons, it makes more sense to have smaller families, to have 1 or 2 or 3 children instead of 4 or 5 or 6. That will happen in Africa, as it has happened in Asia, as it has happened in Europe and the Americas, but it will happen later. And in the meantime, Africa will continue to grow and its population will boom. Africa is still quite poor in terms of its per capita income, in terms of how people live throughout the continent. Its economies are growing, but it's still, the economies are growing only slightly faster than the population rate. So Africa will continue to grow demographically, but it will continue to remain poor throughout most of the rest of the century. Now, in terms of why Africa is growing so fast, again, it's a young population, it's a poor population, it's a more rural population. Also, as people move to cities, they tend to have fewer children as well, because children are more of a burden in cities, where in the countryside, they're more of an asset. But this is a traditional Mercator projection of the globe, which shows the middle latitudes: Europe, United States, China, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, Australia, quite accurately. But it distorts the poles, makes Greenland look gigantic when makes Greenland here look about 2.5 times the size of Australia, when in reality, Greenland is only about 40% the size of Australia. And it also shrinks the middle latitudes, so that Africa appears here much smaller than it is in reality. Now, we do an equal area projection, which shows the continents in about their proper relative size. It distorts their proportions, but if you see in this next slide that Africa is actually much larger than Europe, bigger than North America, bigger than South America. It is the second largest continent after Asia, which from our standard maps you wouldn't get the idea, the notion of. And this shows, again, when you teach African history, African politics, this is always a slide people use. It shows all the other nations you can fit inside the continent of Africa, that you can fit India, China, the United States, most of Europe, all inside Africa. You can fit the British Isles and Madagascar, China, you can fit in a third of Africa, India in about a quarter, Europe in about a third, the US fits snugly in North and West Africa. So therefore, you see Africa, there's a lot of space for these people to live in. Now, while Africa is booming, its neighbor to the north, Europe, is both losing population absolutely and relatively, especially relatively. So in 1900, there were 400 million people in Europe. At a time, there were 133 million in Africa. So Europe at that time had a quarter of humanity, had a quarter of the 1.6 billion people on Earth. This is also the peak of European imperialism, not coincidentally, and the peak of European global power. Europe's population continued to grow throughout the 20th century, but it grew at a much slower rate than the populations of Africa or especially Asia, such that you go in 1900, 1 in 4 people in the world are European, to 2000, where 1 in 8 people in the world are European, and today only 1 in 10 people in the world live on the European continent. Europe's population probably now will peak at about 750 million people and start to shrink, so that by 2050, Europe's population will be a little over 700 million, not much lower than today. But as the global population continues to grow, only 1 in 16 people will live on the European continent. So thus you go from, say, in 1900, 25% of humanity lived in Europe. 2050, an estimated 6% of humanity will live in Europe. So going from 1 in 4 people in the world being European to 1 in 16 people, that shows it's both, it's slight relative decline, but it's slight absolute decline, but quite severe relative decline compared to the rest of the world. So you see Africa, you see booming Africa population-wise, relatively shrinking Europe, soon to be absolutely shrinking Europe. Now, what about Asia? Now, Asia, of course, is a very large, diverse continent containing, the Himalayas, containing deserts, containing steppe lands of prairies, containing densely populated areas in China and India and in Southeast Asia and so forth. But lumping that whole thing together, currently, and this has been the case throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, about 60% of the globe, 3 out of every 5 people lived in Asia. Today, about 1 in 5 people, 20% of humanity lives in China, 20% of humanity lives in India. So that's 40% of humanity. That's 2/3 of Asia right there. And as China's population peaks, as India's population peaks, as the populations of other major nations in Asia, like South Korea and Japan, shrink, Asia will only constitute about half or slightly less than half of global population by the year 2100. So Asia will continue to grow, but it'll grow much slower than Africa, and its share of global population, which has been stable for a long time, will decrease. China and India, of course, together constitute two-thirds of the Asian population and two-fifths of the global population. China's population is peaking. It grew very rapidly in the last 50 years of the 20th century. Then China in 1980, for fear of overpopulation, developed a very strictly enforced one-child policy, which led to declining growth rates in population and will lead to a shrinking population going ahead, so that China, its population is at about today in 2020, about 1.4 billion people. It will peak in 2030 at 1.5 billion people, and there it will start to taper off and possibly be down to 1 billion people by 2100. So China had between 1980 and 2015 a one-child policy. It later increased it to a two-child policy. Now it's increased it to a three-child policy. But it turns out where before, when China was much more rural and most people lived in the countryside, you had to quite draconianly force people not to have children. Today, now that more and more Chinese live in the city, they can't encourage them to have children. So people now in the past had to be forced to have one child. Now they will by choice only have one child because real estate in Chinese cities is extraordinarily expensive. Education, college is extraordinarily expensive. So it does not pay to have 2, 3, 4 children if you're living in Beijing or Shanghai. India, on the other hand, is still more rural, less developed than China. Per capita income in India is about a third of that in China. And India's population is still growing and will continue to grow, such that by 2030, India will be the most populous nation on the planet, but its population will tailor off, peak at about 1.6, 1.7 billion, and then decline, a little later than China's, but following the same course. India, theoretically, its population growth could be a blessing in that they have a very young population. Younger than China, far younger than America's. So they have a large working age population, but they have a hard time fitting that growing population with their jobs. That essentially the parts of India that are growing the fastest are the most rural and the poorest in terms of population. The parts of India where the population is stagnating are the most urban and most developed and best educated. So what you're producing in India is you're producing tens of millions of young people who have very low literacy rates and can't work in these sort of high-tech jobs that India's cities are generating. So India has a great, and will have in the decades ahead, a sort of mismatch between the available workers and the supply of labor and what sort of labor is demanded. In India, in many ways, lacks the infrastructure to develop the sort of low-skilled jobs by the tens of millions that China developed in the 70s and 80s and 90s as it developed its capitalist system. India will have difficulty growing forward with that in terms of developing those sorts of jobs to meet its growing population. So over time, its increased population will become, whereas China will wish it has more people, India, its population, its growing population will become something of an economic burden and a drag on it by like 2040 or 2050. But again, it's going to peak and decline as well over time. And that gets to fertility rates, which have declined in the US and around the world over time. So in the US, for instance, in 1800, the average American woman had 6 children in her lifetime that survived to adulthood. By 1900, that number was down to 3. By the 1970s, it was down to a little over 2, and now it's down to a little less than 2. Fertility rates have declined even more in Europe, in Western and especially Eastern Europe. They have declined even to lower rates in Southern Europe, in Italy, Greece, and also in East Asia, in South Korea and Japan, where the average woman has about 1 child. Which is, of course, if a couple is producing 1 child, the next generation is going to be smaller than their generation, since you need about 2 children to have what is known as the demographic replacement level. And that is what's leading to global population shrinkage, or will lead. That's leading to parts like Europe losing population, parts like Japan going to be losing population, China eventually going to be losing population, and the same will take place worldwide in the 2100s, in the 22nd century. So what happen. Part of it is, again, economic reasons, that children, as you urbanize, become less of an economic asset and more of a burden. It also has to do with working women. And as women begin to work, more women choose not to have children at all. And those who do will often choose to have fewer children. It also has to do with, in many countries, the lack of institutions or abilities of extended families to care for children for where both parents are working, and that will lead to fewer children. So if you look, say, at places like France or Sweden, which provide daycare and maternity leave and so forth, their birth rates, while lower than in the past, are not as low as those of Japan or South Korea, where they do not make those accommodations. And so let's say Sweden's, the average woman will have 1.7, 1.75 children. In South Korea, it will be about one. And so it will be even lower there. So, in fact, as economies develop, the worst combination you can have for fertility rates is to have a very sort of a combination of a modern economy and a traditional patriarchal social structure, which is what is the case in Japan and South Korea, or for that matter, Italy, Spain, or Greece. And then you get your fertility rates fall through the floor because women have to decide, I either have a job or I have a family. I can't have both. And so that will lead to places like Greece, where nearly half of women in their 20s and 30s are unmarried and don't have children. Whereas in other countries, population, you'll have fewer children than in previous generations. But if you provide for the ability of women to be married, have kids, have a career, and so forth together, it will you'll be more likely, instead of having one or no children, to have, say, two children or so forth. So that's important to understand going forward if one wants to craft public policy to encourage larger families, to discourage population shrinkage. That is important to keep in mind. And furthermore, it's important to understand that population growth has fallen through the floor in countries that are highly traditional and highly repressive towards women, like Iran, where about 30 years ago, the average Iranian woman had 6 children, and today the average Iranian woman has about 1.5 children. And Iran is, of course, an extremely repressive country when it comes to women, but and the same has happened in Egypt and other parts of the Muslim world and the Islamic world, where you have very traditional gender relations, but you still have very low currently growth rates and birth rates and things like that. So it's important to compare across different cultures and religions and societies, how the same thing happens over time in all those places, regardless of the growth of feminism or women working or things like that. That is also important to understand in a comparative aspect. So this shows global fertility rates, which were lower in the US and Europe than they were in the rest of the world, but very high in Asia, Africa, and in the Middle East, and then have declined, especially in those regions, less so in Africa, more so in the Middle East and Asia, but they will decline over time in Africa. And often when they do decline, they fall off a cliff very quickly, as illustrated by Iran, going from, the span of a generation, where your mother might have had 6 children, you'll have 1 or 2. So these things can often change on a dime, and usually for, in terms of lower birth rates or even lower than expected. And this shows the progression of that going forward, that you're going from slightly above replacement rate, which is about 2, to by 2050 and 2100, you're going to have below replacement rate in terms of the global population at all. Africa will have been growing as other countries, other regions, other continents lag behind, but Africa will decline its population growth over time and stagnate. And then other parts of the world, East Asia, North America, South America, Europe, will in fact be markedly shrinking by then in terms of their population. Now, this shows the examples. So Nigeria, you still have extraordinarily high, 5, 6 children per woman, but that will, as you see in these other places, that can decline very markedly. China, it declined in large parts through government efforts. The United States, it declined after the baby boom for economic and social reasons. Germany, same thing. But you can see in the world, it declines as well, that it goes from, the average woman globally having 5 children in 1970 to having 3 in 1990 to having, more, about 2.5 by 2015. So these things, when they change very quickly. And, so Nigeria, if we would go back there in 2045, 25 years from now, that will be down to probably around 3 and so forth. And so that outlines the sources, the causes of these demographic shifts and changes I've been discussing already. Now, urbanization, in 1900, you had 1.6 million people in the world, 1.6 billion, and 5 out of 6 of them lived in the countryside. Were farmers, were herders, were other rural occupations. Today, the world is majority urban, 56% urban, and it's going to continue to grow over the course of the century. It's been growing very rapidly over the last 30, 40 years, and this has taken place on every continent, even in places where the population is shrinking. You having urbanization continuing where it's growing, urbanization rates are even faster. And especially in the developing world, in the poor countries, you're having the growth of megacities in places like China, India, Africa, the Middle East. You're having the growth of cities with what are known as cities with more than 10 million people. The U.S. has none of these, although if you count metropolitan, New York City has about 8 million people and 20 million in the metropolitan area. Dallas and Houston each have about 7.5 million, although far fewer in the actual city proper. But what you have is, in 1950, you had 2 cities in the world with 10 million or more people. And currently, you have 35 cities with that number, and a large number with over 20 million, or in fact, 30 million. These sort of mega cities, these mega conglomerations, which are developing, especially in what we used to call the third world, what today we call the developing world, in poorer nations, like I showed you with Lagos, Nigeria earlier. So the megacities, which are those with over 20 million people, you have Tokyo, which was the first megacity, which developed in the 1960s with over 20 million people, now has 37 million people. So roughly 1 in 4 Japanese live in the Tokyo area. Delhi, the capital of India, or New Delhi, near New Delhi, the capital of India. So the capital region of India has 30 million. Shanghai, the largest city in China, has 27 million. Sao Paulo, the largest in Brazil, 22 million. Mexico City has had about 20 million for about 35 years. Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, has 21 million. Cairo, 21 million as well. So you'll notice where these are located. A couple in Latin America, a couple in East Asia, 2 in South Asia, Delhi and Dhaka, and then 1 in Northern Africa. And then we'll get to where the growth of these are going to be. So this shows Sao Paulo, where you see high rises, you see downtown areas, but you also see large shanty towns really as far as the eye can see, what in Brazil are known as favelas, what in the US we call slums, and they just extend on and on into the hillsides, into where in the US you'd have suburbs and so forth. You have these sorts of makeshift communities which are developing and where most of the growth is. And that's where most of the growth is throughout the world. In these cities, that when you get cities like Mumbai in India or Lagos, Nigeria, or other cities that are going to grow faster and faster over time in Africa and in Asia, it is, you're going to end up with, 3 billion people. With the most likely place for people to live in the world will not be on farms, will not be in cities as we know them, but will be in what we call slums, and that is kind of the future of the city. Now we move on to part 5, the final part, migration, and where people are coming from and where they're going. Obviously, Asia has the most people, and so it is naturally the largest producer of migration to North America, to Asia, and to Europe. Africa, similarly, large amounts. You have people going to Europe and so forth. You also have, as you see here, migration within continents is the most common form of migration. So within Europe, Europeans moving to other places, especially from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, from the poorer parts of Europe to the richer parts of Europe, 41 million. Africans moving to Europe especially from Northern and Western Africa, 9 million. So that's, it's a substantial number, but it's less. Similarly, in Asia, migration within Asia at 63 million, far higher than migration out of Asia. 63 million move within the continent, 17 million move to North America. And it's important to understand that when we think of immigration in America, we think Mexico, although that has largely stagnated over the past 10 years. It's most Latin American immigration to the US comes from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. But even if you combine all that, the immigration current is most immigrants that come to America come from Asia, come from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, and so on and so forth. In fact, in Texas, the largest growing immigrant population is from Asia. And so in Houston, for instance, if you're driving down 290 from Houston to Austin, you'll see about 45 miles outside of Houston, outside of Prairie View, the construction of an 80 acre set of cricket fields, the largest set of cricket fields in North America. And that has been building for the last couple of years. And that is because cricket is by far the most popular sport in India and Pakistan and throughout South Asia. It is there, what the NFL and college football and high school football is to Texas, cricket is to that region. And so what you have is you have lots of people moving to Houston from India and Pakistan, need places to play their sport. There aren't any cricket fields there. And so one of the wealthier immigrants bought this land and decided to set up a cricket complex so they could all go there and play on the weekends and teach their children to play and so forth. So that's an example inside of Texas of where immigration is coming from in the future. But nonetheless, most migration is within continents from the countryside to the cities. You also have immigration from fast-growing areas like Africa to Europe and to other places and to the Americas to a certain extent. Although as populations decline, as the Latin American population stagnates and declines, as the Asian population growth decreases, you'll see somewhat less of this in the future, though still it will in some ways become more noticeable as North America and Europe's population stagnates or declines. You'll have certain people pushing for more immigrants to increase the young workforce and others objecting to that because of changes in demographics and culture. You've already seen this, for instance, in Japan, whose population has been shrinking for about 20 years. They are a very kind of, insular country, and they have steadfastly refused to import immigrants from other parts of the world to increase their labor supply. And that will become an issue going forward in Europe and in the United States. The United States population has grown at its slowest rate over the past 2-3 years, which builds on a long-term trend of declining birth rates and so forth. But it also has been occasioned by COVID-caused immigration to fall off a cliff temporarily. So that is actually the leading contributor to America's population stagnating over the last 2-3 years. And as we all know, immigration is a very live and salient and controversial political issue in America, and will remain so surely going forward. So this shows where people are leaving from and where they are going to. So leaving from Africa and Asia, the most populous regions of the world, moving towards the U.S., Canada, which takes in a large amount of immigrants, especially from East Asia, moving to the wealthier parts of Europe and so forth, moving to Australia, which is a thinly populated, wealthy continent on the periphery of a very heavily populated continent of Asia. And so you can see where people are moving from and where they are moving to in this trend here. And we already highlighted how this creates political controversies and its economic impacts going forward. So I will leave you with that, and I look forward to your questions now. So I will now unshare my screen and here I am, I'm back, and now I will talk to and take your questions. So if you want, the audience can, we'll see if hopefully I can hear you and the audience can ask directly.
I have a question.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Can you hear
him?
him?
Probably really too broad.
I can hear.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. What are some of the political implications as far as political systems and population change? In other words, moving from democracies to more totalitarian dictatorship communism or the reverse? Is there any correlation between population trends and changing political systems?
That is a very good question, and it's a very important question. It's hard to say, given you had democracies developing in rapidly growing countries in the past and other rapidly growing countries being authoritarian. So it can go either way. There's not really a causation there. Theoretically, it's easier to maintain a democracy in a wealthier country. So as populations stagnate, you may have more democratization. But on the other hand, as populations age, you have greater fights over resources, over pensions and things like that. So I would say overall, especially in aging countries, countries where you have a lower working age population, a larger older population, it will lead to what some call illiberal democracies, things like Hungary and Poland, which are slowly growing countries where you have a small working age population. A lot of working age people will leave and go to Germany or Britain and so forth to make a better go of it. And the older population will support leaders like in Hungary, Viktor Orban, who supports kind of traditional values combined with fairly lavish subsidies for the elderly and so forth, and pensions and things like that to support his political supporters. So it won't necessarily lead to dictatorships or totalitarianism as much as it may lead to that sort of more kind of a mixed system of where you have elections, but it's kind of more authoritarian and situations become more zero sum, I guess is the best I can say. A bigger issue there is as it has to do with migration, that as populations decline in some areas, you either lose working age populations or your economy stagnates, or to take care of the older retirees, you import new workers, which brings in new cultures, new languages, new religions, and that becomes controversial. So that will lead to a more dicey sort of politics, I think. But that's a knock-on effect of declining population, of how you handle immigration issues. And that also feeds into this concept of a liberal democracy, of democracies which operate, with some semi-authoritarian aspects to them. So I guess it's a roundabout answer, but it's a very good question, and that's probably the best I can offer you.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So is there a natural resource cap that would create a limit on population growth? I'm thinking mostly about water, but when I was growing up, people used to think if the population got too big, half of them would starve.
Yes.
Is there a natural resource limitation, and what would that look like?
Okay, yes, very good question. Now, this had always been the issue with population, going back to Thomas Malthus in 1800, who said, populations grow faster than food supplies, and that leads to wars, famines, things like that. That was proven wrong due to technological change, use of fertilizer, the growing of new crops. And so that has, to a certain extent, been overcome. But water will prove to be a major issue. So in certain regions, you will see areas being maxed out in terms of population and things like that, in terms of that which can be supported with agriculture, especially if in certain regions climates change, which affect water, which leads to more droughts and things like that. So what I think you'll see less is you won't see a population cap, you'll see populations move. So you'll start seeing people moving from areas which can support more people, or which can't support any more people, to areas which still can, and that will be a major effect going forward. And that will cause all sorts of social instability and things like that. So you have parts of India which are incredibly hot, where temperatures in 30 years could be like an average, could become inhospitable, and you'll have to move to more temperate climates and things like that. So that's what I see happening. The U.S. There was worries in the past the global population would at some point max out its resources if it got to say 15, 20 billion. But it seems the population globally will peak before that happens. However, certain regions will be overtaxed, and that will lead to migrations and movements from drier areas to wetter areas, from hotter areas to more agreeable sorts of areas. So that's a very good question, as with the previous question. And again, it will probably lead to migrations, what could be thought of as kind of climate or agricultural refugees and things like
that. When it comes to legal immigration,
yes,
correct me if I'm wrong, the United States takes in more immigrants legally.
Yes.
Not from devastated areas necessarily, but legally. I mean, we've always historically relied on that immigration. The United States leads the way when it comes to legal immigration throughout the world.
Is that the question?
Yeah, does the United States
Oh,
lead the world?
I think an absolute number. In absolute numbers, traditionally, yes. In terms of percentages of population, Canada is higher, but they have a tenth the population we do. So Canada has similar sorts of, a regulated system of immigration. And I think their rates of legal immigration are somewhat higher than the US now, but that's just because they have a much smaller population. So the US traditionally has, has been a place where it was easiest for immigrants to come, although often the system, as anyone knows, for someone who's trying to get citizenship, there's all sorts of hoops to jump through and bureaucracy, and that often, and so you have the mix of those who come here legally, who get green cards, get residence permits, get citizenship, versus the undocumented population who is here without legal authorization. So you have kind of a two-track system in the United States. And I think in terms of absolute numbers, the US still is the leading destination, though in terms of relative numbers, Canada has outstripped us in that way. And they have a lot more room than us. And it's a similar sort of welcoming destination, especially on the West Coast, especially in Vancouver, which takes in enormous amounts of migration from Asia.
Something that hasn't been talked about at all in the book that I read.
Yes, the book talks more about population levels as opposed to movements, so that's important to consider, and that's a valuable point to bring up in that regard.
So what hasn't been talked about is assimilation. You talk about
yes,
Europe. Face of Europe is changing radically. With birth rates from those people that have come to Europe recently, and then the European birth rates. I mean, Europe is not going to be the Europe we grew up knowing in 50 to 100 years, is it?
Europe has been changing in terms of the immigrant birth rates. That again usually drops off in the second and especially third generations as well. So certainly Europe, especially in Western Europe, where most of the migrants go, especially to urban areas, those have changed markedly. Though in terms of the absolute numbers, even in a country like France, you're dealing with maybe at most 6 to 10% of the population being from North and West Africa or other places outside of Europe and so forth. So it's often a good example of this is in terms of assimilation. Also, some of these immigrants are better able to assimilate than others in terms of education and background and things like that. So, for instance, Germany in 2015 welcomed about 1 million Syrian refugees. It was very controversial at the time, very traumatic for the society. But they often, many of them were well educated, had skills. They have assimilated over the past 5-7 years quite well, and much better than, say, like a lot of immigrants from North Africa and other places where they're coming from rural areas and have very few skills and things like that. And so it varies by the immigrant group, depending on their background and depending on the ability of them to contribute to the society in that regard. One of the reasons Germany did that is because its population has been stagnated or in fact declining for about the last 20 years. So you need they have a shortage of workers, especially low skilled workers. But of course, this does change the makeup of certain towns and areas, which causes a lot of consternation, a lot of difficulties. So yes, so in certain localized areas, in certain towns, in certain neighborhoods, in certain cities, the change is marked. Though in the aggregate level, not as large as we think it is, but it is an important thing to understand going forward. It's also important to understand the varying experiences between certain immigrant groups in different countries, and that yeah, that some do better than others. Some are able to meld better than others. And so, as I mentioned with the Syrian aspect, in fact, it's a common thing in America where you have an immigrant group comes and it's looked down upon, and then they assimilate, and then as they assimilate, they look down upon other immigrant groups that come in. That's it's a classic. It's a classic plan. I mean, it's a classic sort of a trend to happen, and that's actually they've talked to Syrian immigrants who have assimilated and have blended into Germany, and they start looking down on the Turkish immigrants and so forth, much as like, say, Irish immigrants would look down on like Italian immigrants and so forth going forward. And so you see certain aspects of that. But again, European societies were not designed to handle the high levels of immigration as American ones are. They did not have in most of the countries birthright citizenship and so forth, made it more difficult. And so the adjustment period there, the ability to adjust culturally, it's more difficult than in the United States. So you'll see this, especially in small countries, which take in large amounts of immigrants, which we don't think of. We think of France or Germany or England when we think of, controversies over immigration, but it's even more marked in, say, Denmark or Sweden, in countries which, people on the left in America tend to, admire and want to emulate. But if you look at Swedish politics, you look at Danish politics, even the left-wing parties, the socialist parties there have become quite anti-immigrant because you're dealing with small countries that take in large numbers of immigrants, and it becomes quite noticeable. And so that is important to understand, that there's lots of variation between and within countries, but it is a very the issues of identity have become very controversial there in many countries, and as I mentioned with Denmark and Sweden, in countries you wouldn't think of or that aren't talked about much in the United States. So that is an important thing to understand in terms of how immigration is dealt with in Europe versus the United States, and those sorts of issues going forward. And we shall see how that develops in that way. Again, the immigrant groups, as they get into the second and third generation, as has happened in France by now, the families get smaller and so forth, and you have, and these sort of massive demographic changes that would have been feared 30, 40 years ago. It's less significant than before, but still that will be an issue going forward, especially as the local population stagnates or declines. Other questions?
Mike?
Yes. Yes, go ahead.
Can you hear
I
me?
can hear you. Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, in the previous presentation, that presenter said that immigration, talking about the U.S. population tree, was healthy for us to keep a healthy tree. Do you believe that, and why?
It depends. I think it is provided. It is done. It often depends on what sort of immigrants you get in terms of skills and things like that. So, for instance, Canada has a higher rate of immigration than the United States, but it's a more regulated system in terms they try to look for people with, marketable skills and stuff and regulate it. So they get enormous amounts of immigrants. They, legalize them fairly easily, but they try to bring in those who can contribute the most to their society. So it matters based on, it depends on what types of immigrants you're getting and what types of regions you're talking about. So there can be regions in the U.S. where you need lots of low-skilled immigrants to work, in meatpacking or in agriculture. There's other regions where you would need, say, doctors or tech workers or things like that, or engineers. And so it depends on the type of immigrant you're getting and how it meets your economic demands. So I think in the U.S., the previous speaker would be correct, provided it is regulated in such a way where the immigrants are where I think both in the U.S. there should be kind of more. It would be easy. It would be better if it was more regulated, but also easier for those who come here to be able to get citizenship. Because one of the problems the U.S. has is still the supply of visas and work permits and stuff is far lower than the demand, which leads to all sorts of problems of undocumented immigrants and people in the shadows and so forth. The U.S. in many ways could look to Canada as a way to kind of maximize the advantage of immigrants and minimize the disadvantages. So I do think, in theory, he is right, your previous speaker, but by no means in an absolute sort of way. And that, again, has to do with how the government, how immigration is done, and how it is dealt with at the federal level and so forth.
Professor, I think you're talking to my next question. If you were the immigration czar of this country, what type of immigration policy would you advocate? What would you like
yes.
to convey us?
Yes, so that is my thing. That essentially, for those who come here who can contribute, it's still enormously difficult to get citizenship and so forth. The immigration system is still a fee. It's the one part of our government where it's kind of a pay-to-play, fee-for-service sort of thing, where they live off of the fees of those who are filling out forms and things, and getting green, going from visas to work permits to green cards to citizenship and so forth. So that needs to be, massively streamlined in a way. And that would, but on the other hand, you have to kind of regulate these sorts of things you have to both make sure it's done in the proper way and make it possible to do it easily in the proper way. And it's proven very difficult to do that politically, that it's such a lie. It's very difficult to form the coalitions to do these sorts of things. I think, going forward, given the gridlock in Washington, unfortunately, not a lot will get done there in that regard. That you kind of have a sort of polarized system where you have one group calling for essentially open borders and the other group calling for, severe restrictions. And it's very hard to meet somewhere in the middle in that regard. So, yes, so there is a sort of a system I would, think, would be good for the U.S., more in line with Canada's, but it's very hard to get that done politically. It has been for a very long time.
So I think you've given me the answer to my last question. On the southern border, I think you're kind of saying maybe there's nothing we could do.
Oh, you mean in terms of controlling? Oh, no. There's plenty that can be done there, and that is done in terms of discouraging that sort of migration, getting Mexico to cooperate, because the migrants are going through Mexico nowadays, not from Mexico. So there's plenty that can be done and has been done by the previous and current administrations and by administrations before that, the Obama administration, the George W. Bush administration. It's important to remember that those levels, that we get of peak immigration, it was much higher in the 90s and in the early 2000s when you had large amounts coming from Mexico across the border. This is, before they built the barriers at, El Paso and McAllen and San Diego and so forth. It's clear that can be regulated in a better way. And in some ways, as messy as it is today, it's far better regulated than it was, say, 25 years ago and so forth, where you literally had hundreds of people a day streaming from Tijuana into downtown San Diego and so forth. And that you can't, and similarly, from Juarez and El Paso and stuff, and that can be dealt with, and is being dealt with. And I think that can, it's not as, it's not at the levels it was before in terms of the illegal migration and all that. And it can be, it's dealt with in a more forceful way than before. And I think it can be, especially with partnerships with the source, the countries either that they're transitioning through, like Mexico, or that they're coming from, like El Salvador and Honduras, that can be dealt with in various ways to try to lessen both the migration and lessen the need for migration and things like that. So that's important to understand. And it is something that changes. That you used to have 1 million people every year coming from Mexico, from Mexico itself. That has changed a lot in the past 10, 15 years. Now you have people coming from the areas immediately south of Mexico and Central America, but that will presumably look different somewhere, 5, 10 years down the line as well. So yes, so it can be regulated, it can be managed, and it's important to understand that what is happening now is different than what is happening 10 years ago, and what is happening 10 years from now will be different than what's happening today.
Could you go into some detail, because I think you're talking twofold about this problem, that people are coming from South America.
Yes, or Central America,
And
yes.
other places, okay, and then we're trying to regulate on the border. Can you give us some detail about what we can do negotiating with these countries further south to stop the or at least slow the migration? And
Yeah.
specifically in detail, what regulations do you have in mind on regulating the border?
In terms of the southern border, I think things working with Mexico for them to control their own southern border and and turn back migrants within country. That's the big thing. You have to work with the southern neighbors, especially Mexico. I think it's also important to recognize that the majority of people who come here illegally do not come across the Rio Grande or the southern deserts. That's, of course, a very dangerous, perilous, expensive route. The majority of people who come here and are not legally residents come here by air from South America, Central America, from Asia especially. They come here on they fly here on 6-month tourist visas, and then they just stay. So if you're looking at like where the majority of people who are here illegally, they don't do the whole incredibly dangerous route coming, 2,000 miles by foot. They'll just fly here or come here and then, get, a tourist visa and then just stay for, after 6 months is over and, hope nobody finds them. And that's a bigger immigration issue. And that's important because it's important to understand that that is a even large, what happens at the Rio Grande, it's very easy to cover, and it's very it makes for, indelible images and so forth. And it gets a lot of our attention. But in terms of those who come here without authorization, it is much more what I described before, where they come here legally, but then stay beyond their visa point and so forth. And that's the easier way to come, and it's the more common way. So, that has to be dealt with as well.
Thank you.
It's always important to understand when we're dealing with these things what the actual data is, and that is a larger. It makes the headlines, 100th as much, but it's a bigger matter.
Thank you, sir.
One more question, I think, Jeff.
Oh, sure.
Do you have any thoughts about current trends of globalization, how that plays?
Into population movements?
Yeah, GDP.
A
lot of people that come and send their money back to the homeland.
Remittances, yes.
Countries that float on that.
Okay, yes. So globalization has to do with the movement of goods, the movement of money, and the movement of people. And we've had a lot of all three. And so what's happening more recently is you're having countries trying to bring supply chains home. So less movement of goods, more kind of regional trade within regions or within countries. Money, that still moves very much, fairly seamlessly. Now, in terms of movement of people and the remittances, which you're talking about, that is still fairly robust. And that happens mostly within regions. So people moving within Africa or within Asia and then sending their money home. So I don't see much change in that in terms of affecting GDP and things like that. That may change more over the future as globalization becomes less seamless as in the past. But it's very hard to say in that regard how that will affect economies and so forth going forward. It is a very complex issue, and you have a lot of variables at play. So unfortunately, I can't give you a clear answer in that.
It's like a model.
What do I expect? I think there are bigger issues with GDP, mostly domestically with these countries in terms of how they grow, how they provide education, how they provide jobs for their citizens. So globalization, the main issue there is trying to open up, like in Africa, markets in Europe and stuff for their products, for their agricultural goods and so forth. That would have a far bigger effect on GDP in developing countries than, say, issues involving immigration and migration and things like that. A lot of it has to do with domestic decisions they make themselves about their economies.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
Oh, my pleasure.
I'm gonna